is backing a volume based on QCOW. It's being stored on NFS. The question is whether or not something like Nova or Glance should be actually accessing that QCOW file and putting a user's QCOW data into that QCOW file, or whether or not the thing consuming that volume should mount that QCOW file and then treat that as the block device that it will then write whatever goes into it. And the symptom is that right now, Glance is treating that QCOW file as the QCOW file that it's going to write the user's QCOW data into. And so it's taking whatever they've got, which may either not really be QCOW data or could be QCOW data that as it's writing it into that file is not whole yet. And so, until it's written the whole file, it's a corrupted QCOW file. And then once it asks Cinder to do something to that in midstream, you hit the symptom that Rajat is trying to fix, which is that Cinder can't do QEMU image operations on that thing when we've only written half of it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a great summary.
So that
I guess Jay summarize this.
The point is, I guess, to get Eric to tell us whether that is right or wrong, because it seems like, based on what we were talking about with Gorka, that there's a layering violation going on there where we're mixing the use of a volume that happens to have QCOW data in it with the backing store of the volume, which happens to be a QCOW file on disk. And whether or not.
Sorry, yeah. So the operation that actually fails is the extend, right? If it's.
Yeah, but the reason that fails is because we are halfway through writing the user's QCOW stream into a QCOW file and then asking Cinder to interpret that QCOW file as a non-corrupted QCOW file, which can't happen, right? Because it's not complete yet.
Okay, so when I looked into, I think, the customer case that started some of that current issue with Rajat, I thought it was a slightly different reason that it was failing. So I didn't know about the trying to handle a partially written QCOW2 file with QCOW2. The thing that I recalled seeing in Cinder was we do an extend operation that eventually tries to call QEMU image resize, I think. And that fails. I might be mixing up cases here. In one scenario, that operation failed because
No, it is the same thing. So the problem is just that Cinder treats that file as a Cinder volume, which happens to be packed in QCOW in NFS. We as a glance just write that file and it happens to be QCOW. So Cinder is expecting to see QCOW. We have partially written QCOW that has its headers already in place, which is telling this file is 400 gigs or this image is 400 gigs. And then Cinder goes like, I have this 1 gig volume that was asked to make a 2 gig, but the QCOW in disk tells me already that it's 400 gigs. There is something wrong here and fails.
Yeah, so there was definitely a bug in the Cinder side where that failed because it was relying on QEMU image auto detection, and we had a raw volume that had QCOW2 data written into it. And the QEMU image spooling, since it was relying on auto detection, read a size header out of the QCal2 metadata. And it would have actually worked if we had called QEMU image and passed in -f raw.
Yeah. So that's what I said yesterday, and that definitely seems like a bug. But what it sounded like Gorka was saying was that we shouldn't have gotten to that in the first place, because we should not have Glance writing the low-level data format that Cinder is using on the back end, right? Like if we get a volume from Cinder, regardless of what it is backed on and what format it's being stored in the back end, we should treat that as a block device and not muck with the low-level bits, right? Because, for example, and I mean, I think this is still an open question unless Gorka is sure. It sounded, a few minutes ago like maybe Gorka is not sure, but people hand stuff to Glance that they may say is QCOW and we may not know it may be wrong, right? So it's kind of an attack vector to say, Cinder, we want a block device which you provide as an abstraction, as a total byte stream, but instead we're going to take this completely untrusted crap from the user and we're going to write it raw onto the disk and then have you interpret that as the format that you think is there, right? Like if the user knew that was going on, they might be able to craft a QCOW file that they get Glance to write that actually refers to something else on the NFS share that everything else is using as protected backend storage, right?
I think Eric's modem was kind of dying, so maybe he
blinked out again.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize.
Okay, apparently. So I think there are two different things. The case Eric was mentioning is when it's raw volume, in which case Glance can store whatever they want in there directly. There is no container, so it's fine. I was under the impression yesterday that this was also happening when the file that was requested of Cinder was a QCOW image, which is a different use case. Because if you have request Cinder a QCOW2 file and you just write the stuff in there, we get to the situation you were mentioning. Like, whoa, you could break things, or this could be an attack vector, or because
right.
You're
writing a low-level format, right? So if I upload a QCOW file that's going to be backed by a QCOW and NFS to Glance, and I give you QCOW data that says that the backing file is etc password, right? And then I get Glance to write that raw to the disk, and then I go to Cinder and am able to get Cinder to connect that via iSCSI for me. It's going to interpret that QCOW file and expose me etc shadow. So anyway, I guess the point is, it seems wrong to me to have a consuming service like Cinder Nova or Glance mucking with Cinder's low-level storage unless both of them know about it and wrap it, accordingly, such that they don't put user data in.
I personally still don't think we should be doing it, but that's might be just me.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't either. But if we do, we need to have the agreement with with Cinder that hey, we have written untrusted data into this thing. Don't believe it. Or we have wrapped it such that when if Cinder's planning to unwrap it, we need to wrap it so that Cinder will unwrap it. If Cinder's planning to unwrap it, but we don't wrap it, then Cinder's going to unwrap something it thinks is trusted that it created, and potentially believe things about it that it shouldn't. So to me, it seems like the right thing to do is to say, if Cinder is storing a block device on NFS as a QCOW file, only Cinder ever touches that thing and in raw format, and anything that consumes it directly from the back end would need to loop mount it and then treat the resulting thing as a block device.
One question on the glance side, when it's using Cinder NFS, is it requesting raw volumes or QCal volumes, or it may request both?
So it's up to Cinder.
Okay.
So in the NFS driver in Cinder, you default, if you just say, give me a volume, it is a raw volume. But Cinder doesn't really know that it's a raw volume. It just treats it as one. But there's an option where you can opt in to having new volumes created as QCal2 for the NFS driver. But the other scenario that can result in you having a QCal2 volume, which I think is not relevant for interactions with glance, is that if you start with a raw volume on NFS and then do a certain sequence of operations with snapshots, usually while attached to a Nova instance, you can eventually end up having converted that raw volume to QCal2, since we use QCal2 for snapshots. So part of the whole idea with supporting NFS behind Cinder as a glance store was that we were going to at least advise people don't set the option that says use QCal2 volumes, and don't go find your glance Cinder volumes and create snapshots and that kind of thing. Because while that's fine for most Cinder backends, it makes weird things happen with the NFS backend.
So is it possible that
there be? Sorry.
No, go ahead, Gorka.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, would we be able to add a feature to the NFS driver where via the volume type, we can define this type is raw and don't allow snapshots, something like that? That way, it would be easier for operators to actually set this up, and so Cinder would work in a normal way for volumes, but glance would prevent all the nasty things we don't want happening there.
Yeah, I think we could do that.
Because there doesn't seem to be any kind of real use case for making snapshots of these volumes, because from the glance perspective, they're just images. And so they're not actually volumes.
But is it like Cinder perspective? Is that whole backend just images, or is that backend shared between live volumes and images? Because in our perspective, it's just storage where we store blob of data. Much more important notation is how Cinder treats that data. So does Cinder know that that data is just image, or does Cinder know that that data is actually active volume that is being used?
Well, Cinder doesn't really have any code anywhere that would care about that distinction.
So I think there is our problem, because neither do us. So so for us, it's just a block store where we slam blob of data. And if Cinder doesn't have notation for that either, that, hey, this is actually a glance image instead of just someone's volume, we need to have some boundaries there to actually make it work. Otherwise, yeah, all these nasty things will just keep happening.
We don't need to know that it's a glance image. We just need to know what the intended format of that file is in the context of the Cinder driver.
I think it's dangerous to do that, because glance can tell you what it thinks it's going to be, but at the end of the day, it's going to be whatever the user provided. So I think it's dangerous to have Cinder.
There is that, and on the other hand, we as a glance, because we are just Cinder API consumer, we have no idea what Cinder thinks the backend should be. So even if you have it typed down in a volume type that, hey, this is type X, we as a glance have no way to knowing that.
Yeah, but I think going back to Dan's comment of the danger of Cinder knowing it, I think what Eric is getting at is basically fix the bug that we have where Cinder tries to use the auto detection. Then if we tie that up with volume types supporting specifying raw volumes, then Cinder will think that that is a blob of data and will never try to do any introspection or anything in there. And then if we prevent a snapshot as a feature in the volume types, we make sure that users don't start using those images for crazy things. So it would come down to fixing a bug, a couple of features in the Cinder volume types, and documenting what is the recommendation if you're using an NFS backend for glance storage.
Yes, although it seems to me like what we've got is the layering violation, which is that Cinder might interpret this file in certain situations, but we're going to add some flags and notation to try to prevent it from doing that in certain situations. I'm not completely following everything that you're suggesting, but
okay. The raw part is because basically we have removed it from a bunch of places, so we are no longer doing the auto detection in let's say 5 places, but there are still a couple of places where we are not forcing the format, and that is one of that is the bug that started all this when we suddenly were not interpreting the volume as raw, and we were letting QEMU image to auto detect. So as if we fix that bug, it doesn't matter what glance writes in a raw volume. We will not care.
Okay, but can you, is that fixed based on the fact that you've told people don't use QCOW on NFS to back glance images, or is it the thing that?
Yep.
But that's just telling people don't configure this, otherwise there's a huge security violation, right?
Yep.
So that's my point. It still seems like we've got this layering violation, and the solution to not having this layering violation, or the solution to not having this be a glaring security problem, is to can tell people to not configure it in such a way that might cause Cinder to ever interpret user QCOW data. So, I mean, it's up to you.
Alternatively, the glance store could check this and reject the volume type.
It's still papering over the problem, I think. But yes, but
what's the alternative? Mounting it, having QCOW, and then not being able nested QCOWs and not being able to use it in Nova?
Well, the solution, the right solution, I think, is to get rid of the layering violation, which yes means nesting and teaching Nova or hiding it in Brick or doing something to move us towards the right solution instead of just like saying, well, we made this layering violation, there's a huge security liability, so we're going to try to not touch it. I mean, I understand that this is like work on 3 separate projects to fix, so I'm not trying to like say, damn it, this is what we should do. I'm just saying seems sketchy to me. The other, there was something else. Oh, so why is, if Cinder ever thinks that this is raw, why would it use QEMU image to extend it, even telling QEMU image that the format is raw? Just because it's easy? I mean, like, why would you not just do a truncate call or something?
Yeah,
instead of calling this thing which wants to auto-detect the image, telling it not to auto-detect it, and then having it be effectively, you know, you're spawning a process to do a truncate call for these raw things, which could just be.
Well, I think in that particular, the most recent place that came up on resize, it was down in NetApp NFS driver code that called some resize operation in our image util stuff. But in that context, we don't know what it's supposed to be. And that's kind of the source of a lot of these problems in Cinder is we don't have a field that tells us what the format actually is. And I think a lot of this stuff would get cleaned up if we actually kept track of that as volume metadata, so we didn't have to make assumptions about formats.
I mean, presumably you could have a similar, I mean, it's super dangerous to ever tell somebody, okay, this is a raw block device. It is purely blocks 0 through n, and you can store anything that you want in it. Connect that to an untrusted instance, let them use it raw, and then have the stuff that shows up there be in a thing that you might later, do a format detection or an inspection or trust that that's a properly formed QCOW or VMDK or anything kind of file, right? So it kind of seems like ever interpreting the contents of something that you have handed to an untrusted person as a unstructured format and then later relying on that structure is dangerous. I mean, it seems like there might be a way to exploit this through Nova, even iSCSI attached.
Well, it doesn't actually happen on any iSCSI drivers, but yeah, it's definitely. I get what you're saying about it being hazardous, and we have some mitigations in Cinder, and I think Glance does too, about looking for suspect backing file fields and that kind of thing for the obvious cases. But yeah,
it's just a risky way to go about it. But anyway, all right. Well, I've said my piece, so.
Just wanted to add some information regarding the image volume that we create from Glance side. So there are options to set the project in which the volume will be created. Also, the volume is set bootable to none, false, I mean. So that volume is purely separated from normal tenants and normal users. And there is a documentation also around it. So we won't be performing, like there is a documentation that we shouldn't perform any operations on that volume. So just wanted to mention that volume is separated from rest of the deployment.
Is that always the case, or is that just the recommended case? I would expect that you would potentially want to be able to configure it such that if you upload an image as tenant foo, that it shows up as a volume as by tenant foo, so that they get charged or see it or whatever.
So in the deployments I've seen, they usually prefer the service tenant there, and mostly like it's a config option, we can set it, and we shouldn't be really seeing or performing any operation on that volume. So that's why it is recommended to keep it separate.
Even if it's recommended to be configured that way, I still think that someone skimming the documentation would assume that it's not a liability. So it just anyway. But that's good that it's
regarding the accounting you mentioned to charge customers, they would go to Glance. So it would be Glance usage, not Cinder. They cannot double charge. If they are using Cinder as a storage for Glance, they cannot charge you for the image in Glance and then for using Cinder space, right?
No, I know, but I mean,
So
one way to look at that is to say, well, we're just going to ignore all glance charging at all because we're just charging for storage regardless of what you use it for, and so we're just going to charge you for your Cinder usage, no charging for glance usage, and it's a data volume or an image doesn't matter. I can just see somebody wanting to do it that way.
yeah, but isn't Glance using a specific user, or is it using the user's project ID and everything to store the volumes?
It's using the tenant's credentials.
Wow, so the tenants will just see new volumes popping in there for
Yeah,
their
no,
Glance images?
no.
I thought they
So
were
there are
using it by a service account.
I thought Rajat just said it was configurable.
Yeah, so it is configurable. If you don't configure it, then it goes to the context user and tenant. But if you configure it, then it goes to that.
Oh yeah, there is
Okay,
that.
Yeah, I think most
okay,
people
yeah.
do it because otherwise you have the problem of people deleting these volumes that they think aren't theirs out of Cinder, and then Glance doesn't know about it until it goes to serve an image and can't. But you're right, it's
Also, in the cases in the deployments that I've fixed, some cases they usually prefer they configure it. So I think it's more deployment side.
Well, I still think that if especially, it sounds to me like it defaults to use the user credentials and it only doesn't if you configure a service token. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, regardless, I mean, people have reasons for doing all kinds of stuff, right? And just charging for storage on the storage and, you know, I don't know. I would not write that off as like, well, if you configure this the non-default but recommended way, then we shouldn't have this, glaring security problem. Is, not a good mitigation. But
yeah, I wonder whether well, this
These
is a Glance question though, not a Cinder thing, whether it should be mandatory to have a service user associated with your Cinder Glance store. I think it was implemented originally to be on a, par with, because with Swift you can do either one.
yeah.
But you have the same problems in Swift where, people start deleting these objects that they didn't put there and then find out later that they can't boot any of their VMs because the snapshots are all gone.
can't you arrange Cinder policy to allow regular users not to delete volumes that have some piece of metadata that Glance would have set on there such that you can have them show up but not? No?
I think that's a hack in terms of Cinder, because if a volume belongs to a user, they should be able to do whatever they want. It's their volume.
Also,
right?
The problem is that if you do that, Glance have no way to delete it because the Glance uses just the user's credentials for it.
Fair enough. Yeah. I still think that there's either we need to make the call that this is not legit, it has to be a separate set of volumes, or we have to assume that people will use the arrangement that is allowed and sounds like is default to do that. And I there's all kinds of clouds. There's clouds where the users are completely untrusted, anonymous paying users, and there are clouds where there are 4 tenants, they're all internal projects, they understand why they have volumes got created from their images. Saying that they really should not use the default config is just, problematic, I think.
So I just wanted to mention the example of image volume caching. So when we create a volume from image and we enable the image caching, then we store it in a separate tenant and we just clone volumes from it. So that's also similar to this case where like it's an image volume which is bootable in image cache, and in this case it's just an image stored in a volume. So both are most probably stored in the same tenant. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that we can also configure image volume cache, like where the volume should be stored in which tenant from Cinder side.
I don't see how that's related.
Yeah, so we shouldn't be performing any operation on the image cache volume as well. So it's kept separately, similar to this case.
Yeah, I think the difference with that case is that that is an internal feature of Cinder, and Glance, even if it's an OpenStack project, it's an external user from the Cinder perspective.
That's how I see it as well. Like we are just a Cinder consumer that happen to use Cinder as a backend. We are not, and we shouldn't be tied to a Cinder internals because we don't have access to Cinder metadata. We don't have access to any special rules. What there is, we should treat them just like, okay, we request volume for our use case. We use that volume. And so in anything that is kind of out of those boundaries, us being like any other consumer for Cinder, is just a hack.
Yeah.
And is prone to problems.
And part of the reason why getting out of this situation is difficult is because we now have 3 projects that all have to agree on a low-level storage protocol. And changing that is difficult because they all have assumptions. And if we didn't have that from the beginning, then Cinder, would be able to transition away from this or, to something else. We could be talking about anything else, QCal v3, or something. But having them all silently gentle person's agreement on the, super low level details just is way too tight a coupling, I think.
But I don't see an easy way out of this either case.
No.
Because it's not like we could just request a iSCSI pipe to that block device and use it as normal consumer would use it. Because we need to go through the backend. Which is the start of the problem here.
No, that's okay, but I feel like we could get ourselves out of this by making sure that everybody is using Brick for getting access to the volume, and then Brick is able to know whether this is a properly double wrapped or improperly legacy single wrapped thing, and either trigger a conversion when a time arises, or know whether it needs to be double unwrapped or single unwrapped, and have Glance and Nova both not use the direct native thing if that's what we're going to do. I mean, and then Cinder can prescribe a way for users to double wrap this thing going forward. I guess I haven't heard anybody argue. Maybe there is an argument for we should not double wrap this thing, and we absolutely should have this tight coupling because performance and the security concern that comes from it is worth the performance benefit, whatever. I mean, is that an actual opinion that anyone has?
Well, I've heard that probably if you're going to have a bunch of volumes using NFS, probably using MBD to mount a QCal for the double nesting, it's going to be basically useless. What you get from that whole scenario.
But I guess it seems to me like the better solution is to say, hey, if you configure Nova to use QCal on volumes that are backed by QCal, performance is going to suck. Nobody's data is going to get screwed over, but the performance is going to suck. What you really should do is configure one of them to use, raw, sparse, whatever, and then QCal on top of that. But regardless of which bad decision you make, you're still not going to open up the potential for misinterpretation of the low-level thing. Seems to me like that's a better situation to have than be absolutely sure that you've got Glance configured to use service tokens. You've got Cinder and Nova, which are never going to interpret the contents of this thing. And if you don't do all of those things, potential dragons.
So I'm trying to think through the implications of this double wrapping idea. So this would basically be to always have the volumes have a QCOW2 layer that we use to store data, right?
Yeah.
Well, so, only if they are QCOW2 backed volumes, right?
Maybe.
So only in the only in the situation where Lance is using Cinder as a data store and Cinder NFS is writing to QCOW2 files instead of raw files. Only in that scenario would we do the double.
Right, and the point being that it doesn't really make sense if you're already using QCOW2 images to configure the backing store for that Glance backend to be something that ends up as QCOW on the Cinder side, because performance would suck. You can do it, but like Glance using Cinder or Nova using Cinder or anything else using Cinder should not know that Cinder is behind the scenes storing all of this in QCOW to optimize space. Like if that is happening, that's cool, but like the consumer of a block device should not know that.
Right? Yeah, I mean, I don't think we really want to use QCOW2 storage for the Glance scenario anyway.
Yeah, we don't, but we cannot prevent. That is the thing that Dan is trying to insist on.
Yeah, and the problem what is in all of this is that as long as Cinder is not enforcing either or, you will need to have that auto detection there if you are having mixed volumes in a single NFS store. So if you have some cases QCOW and some cases not, you are not enforcing it, nor you have metadata indicating on that volume what the packing file type is, if it's raw or QCOW. The only way how you can deal with it is as it is at the moment, which is the auto detection. And at that point, like we need to either have the double wrapping there and just get the file descriptor, or
I think we are mixing things.
Yeah, I'm not sure why
we just assume
for auto detection in there.
Yeah, we are assuming that which Eric said, I think his first sentence, there is a bug in Cinder, we have to fix it, not use auto detection. That is, we assume that is going to happen. We are not going to use auto detection. We are going to know that this is raw, and we will handle that part. Now it is the next scenario. What
but that should solve all the problems then.
Nope.
No.
If the user configures NFS to use QCOW2, then it is not raw. And when you write your QCOW2 in that QCOW, same situation we have right now will happen. So it comes to a deployment configuration option, which Dan doesn't like, because it's kind of hoping that people read the documentation, deploy things correctly. Yeah, sure.
It's also, I mean, I don't know if you watched the summit presentation that I can't remember the guy's name, but he gave a couple of debugging OpenStack obscure red herring things, and he gave an example of a seeming neutron bug where you create X number of routers and then the last one just stops being created. But if you create it not HA, it works. And like, what is going on? This is clearly a neutron bug, and it all boils down to, no, actually you're using this encapsulation protocol on your Ethernet, and it only has 200 bits of VLAN tag space or whatever, and then Neutron suddenly stops being able to create routers. This is a similar situation where you're asking people to kind of understand how QCal files work, to understand the liability that they are opening themselves up to when they configure what they think is just sparse, sparse storage turtles all the way down. It's asking more than just reading the docs. It's asking them to kind of understand the full end-to-end implications of something that we're allowing them to configure, which it sets them up for a really, scary situation.
Well, I think we can get out of that without relying on docs. I mean, in this path between Cinder and Glance, you could prevent that situation by having, when Glance creates the Cinder volume that it's going to store data in, if it gets back a QCal2 file, it can just fail the operation there and not do it, instead of relying on documentation about that configuration, which is not, super friendly, but it does.
Or we can do, if you are gonna enforce the Cinder dealing with the QEMU image correctly so that it doesn't auto-detect, and you add the NFS parts to Brick so that we just get the file descriptor we can write to as a block device.
Brick doesn't provide
it doesn't matter
for this kind of stuff.
Well, maybe it should, because that would void our problem, because then it's between Brick and Cinder to figure out what type of file it is, if it's a flat file or QCal2, loop mount it, give us the file descriptor, and we just write it like a block device, and we will never need to worry that we are messing things up for what Cinder does internally.
That to me is what our interface to Cinder should be, regardless of how we get it. And Eric, I don't know, you said it doesn't provide a file descriptor, but in the case of a thing where we're attaching via iSCSI or something else, it does provide us okay, here's the dev mapper foo path, right, that I've hooked up for you, and it could do the same thing for files on NFS, whether they are raw or they are QCal2, and we don't need to know, and we shouldn't know.
But it's like RBD, there are performance implications.
I think there's
with RBD, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say, I think that also gets into, so you would want to do that for Glance consuming NFS Cinder volumes, but then what about Nova using NFS Cinder volumes? Because you can't.
I think, don't you think that it's a bit of a risk to have Nova writing your low-level format? I mean,
into your backend directly?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Nah, it's Nova. It's fine.
Well, you have attached snapshot functionality that relies on libvirt being able to do that.
Well, that's true. That's true.
And if you wrap it, I think that's not going to work anymore.
That's true. I'm not sure that. Yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't change my feeling about. I mean, I don't really know why people want to do file on NFS anyway, but. The difference, I guess, it's a little bit different between Glance and Nova, and maybe the argument is that Glance needs to be more like Nova, although I think that's going to be a bit of a uphill battle. So the difference here is that Glance is taking unknown format user data and shoving it directly into your low-level backend. Nova, at least, you're trusting Nova that Nova is putting the interpretation layer between the user, which is they just have access to the instance, and your backend thing. But Glance is not doing that and has not historically done that because images are just a blob of data, right? So I've been equating their use case, that Nova and Glance are both the same consumer of Cinder, but it is a little bit different because, you're getting Nova to put the hypervisor in between anything the user has access to and your backend. But then with Glance, you're saying, nope, the user can just pipe data directly into your low-level format.
Yeah.
So basically, we need to have Glance spin up libvirt instances, I guess, is what it sounds like.
No.
No. Oh, okay.
Certainly be interesting.
We could have Glance call to Nova, spin up an instance, attach the volume, then pipe the data through.
Or Dan, we can just attach all the schedulers directly to Glance and just bypass Nova and let just Glance put those instances directly.
There you go. Can anybody mute Erno? Well, anyway, I mean, I don't know what the right path forward is now that I've broken my 2-against-1 thing, but yeah.
Well, I think we would want. I agree with the fact that we don't want users to be able to do something that they may not understand the implication of, where they write QCOW2 on top of QCOW2. So I think we should just prevent that in the Glance store. Say, nope, this is not going to work. QCOW2, I don't use NFS with QCOW2. That's it.
So that's just a special case check for Glance's NFS backend, or Cinder NFS backend, I guess. I'm not really sure how.
Well, the check is going to be done by Glance store. It's basically similar to if Cinder starts and suddenly the driver checks the backend and says, ooh, this operating system is too old. I don't work without the storage array. Please update the firmware. Similarly, Glance store would check, if Cinder is providing NFS with QCOW2, it would say, nope, this is not good.
It needs to be if NFS,
like this.
It needs to be if NFS is providing anything but raw, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
and I think that.
Yeah. So in the Glance store driver for Cinder, where you're in the NFS setup scenario, after you've done create volume and then you attach it, basically you want to get an empty file for the volume, which is a raw formatted volume. And if you get anything that's not empty there, then just don't use it and just fail that operation.
Or we can just go, like, if we get NFS backend back from Cinder, we just go, nope, this ain't gonna be working. This has way too many problems and restrictions already in place. We just won't use it.
Yeah, it's just that we got all these customers giving us all that money. So, I mean, yeah.
Okay, so I think the thing is basically fixing the auto detection so that raw images are known to be raw, and adding in the Glance store oops, this will not work because your I'm not getting a flat file in here. And then maybe as a future improvement, we could go to enabling through volume types the selective raw file instead of QCOW for an NFS backend. So you don't have to have all the files in there the same. But that I think it's something for later.
Well,
to fix the bug.
I think that those two checks on either side, make Cinder stop doing the format introspection. Everybody agrees needs to happen. I don't have any good solutions. I still think that having Glance treat this as a special banned case is obscure and wrong, but I have no other suggestions. So at the very least, given what we have right now, it needs to probably do this check just to prevent us from all having a weekend CVE, and then if there's a better solution that comes out sometime later, but I think that needs to be done.
But double wrapping it, no one won't be able to boot it, but it doesn't make it. So if we get QCOW as a Cinder volume, and our view is we are just writing a blob of data into it, what is the problem that is going to cause? Why should we reject it? I think that's the big question.
I think that if Nova is using, doesn't Nova know, I should know this, but if Glance is using the NFS backend and provides a URL that matches something that Nova has, doesn't Nova try to go direct and get that?
No, Nova goes direct only in the Ceph case when they are both configured in a way that they will share the backend pool.
Well, if that's the case, then double wrapping it wouldn't matter. But I think that the difference is that what Eric was pointing out is that we can't have, if we were to bake that something into Brick, Nova would not be able to use that. You would have to have Glance use that because Glance is treating, and I don't know what Brick looks like at all, really, to be honest. Maybe Brick has a give me the general purpose thing I can do with this, and Glance needs to use that, and anything else, if Neutron wants to store a domain file in Cinder, it would use that as well. But Nova needs to not use that because it needs to go direct to the back end. Maybe that's what actually would need to happen.
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit lost on why we went back to wanted to support QCOW2 on NFS. Like, we just set this as a deployment restriction. This is not secure in our OpenStack deployment. We don't want it, so we don't allow it.
Yeah, but
I don't see that big of a problem.
Well, I understand. It's whack-a-mole, right? It's like picking a specific thing and saying this thread, if you stack this all together, this is insecure and problematic and slow and whatever else, and just baking that rejected vertical stack into all of the projects that are available, that are part of that stack, is obscure and confusing, because if someone were to just look at the config files, it seems like this should all work, and then all of a sudden you configure it that way, and it's like, oh, no, we've decided that you don't want to do that. Whereas the right solution to me is to have it not the layering violation, but we're going to have the layering violation with Nova and Cinder anyway for reasons. So
for me, the right solution is the one that makes people using OpenStack not think that the performance is garbage. So I don't care as much as supporting 100% of the existing use cases and configuration options. I prefer to support 99, even 90%, and say what we have, we are happy with what we have in terms of performance. Supporting something that it's going to be terrible performance-wise, even if we figure out the whole double nesting, whatever, we don't want people to use it, and we are going to do our best for people not to use it. So why spend all that time figuring out how to support it?
I understand. I don't really have a good argument for you, other than just, it's just I don't want to support things that are pathologically stupid either. Nova doing double wrapped QCOW on top of QCOW on top of NFS for writable workloads would suck. I don't think that Glance storing what is actually just a blob on top of QCOW on NFS is any worse than not double wrapping it. It's basically the same thing. And the bad performance of double wrapping it only happens when you've got something that is interpreting both layers of indirection together for every read. But for the Glance workloads, you're just downloading that blob, and it doesn't really matter whether that blob is itself a QCOW file or not. Like, it's the same performance.
That's my point. So if Cinder prevents that auto detection, which already solves our security issue, what's the problem having
doesn't solve the security
writing the
issue.
image?
It doesn't, Erno. If NFS gives you a QCOW2 and you write QCOW on top of that, we have the problem. So because Cinder thinks it's a QCOW. So
no, Gorka, listen, no. So the right thing is not to go and refuse to write. The right thing to do is, if Glance gets QCOW2 from Cinder, Glance loop mounts to it and writes inside the QCOW and keeps the wrapping correct.
Yeah, then we break snapshots, then Cinder using that image to do.
So why should you have a snapshot on images anyways?
Well, that's
not on the image. When the image is used to create a volume, you get double the nested, and then you cannot do a snapshot. And when Cinder creates volume from image, it will be created. We are messing everything for something that we don't want. Anybody would be happy with this, because I'm sure anybody deploying this would figure out 10 minutes after running the first VM that this is garbage, spend 2 days trying to figure out why this is garbage, then complain about OpenStack, and then fix it and not write double QCOW thing.
So if it breaks every time, why does Cinder store it in QCOW ever in the first place?
Because
it doesn't break
snapshots. Because it's how we implement snapshots for generic NFS. That's why QCOW2 is here ever.
Ooh. Okay.
Because it gives a way to build snapshot functionality for Cinder on top of a backend that doesn't have anything other than dumb files on it.
Aha.
I still stick to my pristine argument that that it's less good that the performance of double wrapping doesn't matter for storing Glance payloads in the back end. If that's where they were to configure it, it would not be the garbage that Gorka is talking about. What would be garbage is if Nova had to do that for read-write workloads. I don't think it matters much for storing blobs, and nor does it really make any sense, but it wouldn't be garbage performance. It just would be not really any gain.
Yeah.
But that is more work than, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Eric, but let me just say that will be more work supporting that for a case that should work, in my opinion, and therefore there's no reason not to. The easy thing to do, and the smallest amount of work, separate from the fixing the format detection thing in Cinder, is to just tell Glance, refuse to do anything but raw if the backend is NFS. And even though that doesn't solve the problem, it solves the problem. So let's at least agree that we can do that in the short term.
Because the problem that is going to cause is now the deployer needs to make the decision, do they want their volumes have a snapshots, or do they want to store their images on that backend? Because on a normal Glance use case, if we use the Cinder, even if it has a double wrapping, and Nova comes and requests us that image, we will be streaming that QCOW to Nova instead of streaming it as a raw data. And Nova will do with that image like it would do on any QCOW image. And there is no snapshotting in between, but that just means that if we refuse to do that, that deployer will have to specify that volume type not being utilizing QCOW, so they will never have a snapshot out of that backend.
Two things. First, you don't have to select one or the other because you can create a secondary Cinder backend using the same NFS shares and configure it to do raw, one QCOW, the other two, the second one raw. And then I also suggested as a future improvement to be able to select whether it's raw or QCOW based on the type. Next, you say it doesn't matter because you stream the data, but what about the Cinder case where we actually we know where the Cinder is passing us the source of the storage and we use it to do efficient cloning and not have to stream the whole data? We would be breaking that code path.
It would. On the downloading of this double wrapped image, so when you're using it as a Glance user,
Glance would strip the outer layer. I mean, you would naturally get the outer layer stripped because Glance would then reattach again, stream the contents instead.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
that's what I was thinking, but I wanted to make sure about that.
Yeah.
But now if we no, that won't actually be. So if we enforce the Cinder layer, that won't be a problem. If we would enforce the Glance image format, then you would basically get the space benefit of QCOW in Cinder volume, but you would just like totally dump your network when you are streaming that image back and forth.
So, Gorka, when I think that you were hinting at something, because you can create a volume from an image, right? Is that the workflow that you're worried about breaking with this?
Well, create volume from image where Glance is providing the locations of the
Cinder's
storage.
like, oh, I don't need to download it. I've already got it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I just clone it. I'm good to go.
Yes. So that would need to change because Cinder would need to know that, Glance did not provide the low-level format. Glance stored the format in something that you have. So I think that is broken too, and I imagine that there's probably a attack vector where Glance, a user has uploaded, well, I don't know what all Cinder does with it, but basically, I've uploaded a low-level raw format that maybe Cinder is going to interpret in a risky way as it creates that image, that volume from image, depending on how it mounts it and accesses it, I guess. But
my concern is we implement this double nesting. We program it, we do the OSBreak changes, we do everything just to figure out we've broken a Cinder option that's been working for 5 years, and now we have to fix something else. It's like, really?
So Gorka, how does it work if we store QCOW on, let's forget that we are talking about NFS, if we have a proper block device? How does the cloning work in that case when the image format is QCOW?
You mean create volume from image?
Yeah.
I think it probably downloads
it. Doesn't Cinder actually like unwrap that from QCOW?
No, I think it just asked Glance to give the data.
Right.
Probably.
The shortcut
so,
is
what would change in NFS case, because the image type is QCOW, Cinder would never try to do the immediate cloning anyways.
Why not? It's a share. Because it's nice.
You just say that it will never try to do it. It will ask Glance to stream the data.
No. I think that what the problem is that the NFS driver on Nova, the NFS backend for Nova and for Cinder and probably for Glance, it's all just a big batch of like layered shortcuts that like, oh, I can just access this thing. I'm gonna go get it. It's gonna be so much more efficient and whatever, right? I mean, that's what I'm learning here. I think is that Cinder does special things if it's NFS, so that I don't have to go get the thing. Nova does that so that
okay,
yeah, will work. I just want to know if Gorka and I are still friends, because I can't. The beard thing is really messing with me, and I'm worried that Gorka, like, if we were in the same room, that I would like be missing a throat in this region here or something,
Nah, no, I just speak loud when I get, into things. Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Well, I think that
not going portal yet.
I think we've been talking about this for over an hour, and there's lots of stuff in people's heads. So I think that we ought to record that we've got a bug on the Cinder side and a bug mitigation, whatever, check for only raw and NFS to add on the Glance side for safety reasons, if nothing else. And we ought to, punt on the rest of, boiling this for the moment.
Yeah, and we can leave for a later conversation if we should remove the restriction on the Glance store and support QCOW2 and come back to it and say, okay, what would it look like? Maybe do a POC and confirm everything works. Yeah, we can revisit it afterwards.
Okay. I think that's. We can all think it over and then complain about it tomorrow. All right, I think this was productive. I think we know what we're doing. Get out of here.
I have my performance question too, if anybody's interested in that part.
Oh, I was hoping that somehow was moot at this point, but go ahead.
No, it's a whole different thing. So I have not tested this or looked into it, but I was just looking through the Glance store code, and I think, so there's a loop, right, where it writes a gig of data and then it does a volume extend and then it writes another gig of data to upload to a Cinder volume. But I think if I read this right, it actually disconnects the volume and reconnects to it every time between these 1 gig segments, which seems to me like it would be a huge performance loss on deployments that have a decently fast network to stream data over. And so I don't know, I'm just wondering if anybody has looked at fixing that to do an attached extend, or if anyone has even considered that this might be an issue or what, because it seems like it would really hamper your ability to quickly transfer data for large images.
So Eric, if I understand correctly, all backends cannot do attached extends, right? Like NFS, for example.
I don't even remember. That's probably true. I don't know.
Yeah, I had this idea of creating the volume of the exact size of the image to avoid all the extend code, but I think that would require reading the image twice or something like that. And we discussed it, and I think Dan didn't like that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think the naive approach in the patch was like, oh, we'll just download the whole thing to /temp and then we'll look and see how big it is, and we'll create a volume and write it. But that means we require non-trivial
we can
storage.
improve on that. It was just a POC type of code, and we can surely improve on it. But
yeah, I know. I'm just
idea was to eliminate the extend code. Yeah.
Well, it seems like there may be cases where we can know the size in advance, and so then we could take advantage of that. And then in the other cases, you just get shitty performance.
Yeah, that would be pretty useful to just request a volume that's big enough in the cases where you do know the size up front. I don't know how common it is to know the size up front versus not.
I think
I don't know.
Go.
Do we have any alternative for NFS if we cannot do the live extend? I mean, this is the only option if we don't have a live extend, right?
Why would NFS not support a live extend? Because it's just a file, so isn't it just updating a kind of arbitrary limit?
That's a good question. Somebody at one point actually added attached extends to the NFS driver and then turned it back off because something was found that was problematic, but I don't actually know what the whole
NFS driver currently has a bug that we fixed in order to support attached extend.
So you're saying maybe it does support online extend now?
I think the driver has it turned off. The question is whether we could turn it back on. And
this is
I would assume the answer is yes if we try hard enough and do it right, but I don't think anyone's looked at it.
Every file system since like 1972 has tried to make this not a problem for us, and so this is just like file on file system. I really, really would hope.
So the bug that was mentioned preventing NFS that maybe now is fixed, where was that bug? Was it in the driver? Was it in a tool used for the extend?
Well, I lost my Etherpad link. Here is one of the related bugs. There's a lot going on in there, though, and I haven't read it today, so I don't know.
So we had a discussion, I think, in the previous Cinder meetings, and I started working on the bug fix, but my manager told, hey, stop doing this and please implement some new features. So it's frozen state, waiting for new contributor for continuing it. But the idea is that the Cinder NFS driver side is trying to run QEMU image resize and something, and it fails because it cannot acquire a lock that is coded by libvirt from Nova side. And the solution is to do nothing from the Cinder side and just let the Nova perform the operations on the extend operation, and then discussing the meetings, we found a bunch of concerns that we needed to make sure that they are safe to be implemented. So yeah, it might take some time to have this feature back working again.
Yeah. So thanks for the Etherpad. I forgot about half of this, but part of the reason it was reverted was because when it was first landed, it wasn't considered how it was going to interact with snapshots and encryption. And I think there's a few problems there that had to get sorted out before we could just do this. And then some of our Nova friends went and tested encrypted volumes on NFS as part of this and found even more problems that had nothing to do with extension. And now there's a whole pile of bugs there to figure out too that I think we're still catching up on.
Okay, I think we've got a way forward with this. So thanks. In Shanghai at 5 o'clock, they physically kicked us out of the building to end the PTG. So we're at the end of our time, so I'll do that now. So thank you for attending. Add notes to Etherpad if you think of stuff. I think we're okay on this. And see you tomorrow. So I will stop recording.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.